Questions about anything before we start? I'm still entering the tests in, so I'll probably have them graded by Friday, hopefully. So that I'm moving through them. Any questions about anything? I'll go over the test next week as well. How'd you think the test was? Do you think it was easy? Pretty, somewhat hard? Very hard. So remember, what's the magic word? The magic words? Partial credit, right? Figure that what people are going to do is that everyone sort of thinks it's like this. So what I do is I grade on a curve. So if you think you did pretty poorly, probably other people think they did pretty poorly too. And so I'll grade on the curve when I come out. Anything else? Anything about the test or about? Okay. So this week, going to talk about medical education and becoming a doctor. After that, the weeks that follows that we will talk about sort of financing and cost of healthcare, and then what can we do to control costs and how healthcare systems can make better decisions and things. Then we'll talk about pharmaceuticals and drugs. Then on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving will be movie day, where I know, where you don't have to come to class. I'll Zoom a movie because what I found in the past is that if I hold class on Tuesday before Thanksgiving, it's pretty much just me. I'm in the class. So I'll go through and we'll just do a movie day. And it'll be a movie by which I haven't decided which one yet, but it'll be a movie that if you want to watch on your own, you can also just rent it and watch on your own. And then after Thanksgiving, then we have a talk about healthcare in other countries. And then the final week then is review session and then the second exam. So not that many weeks left. You're supposed to go, oh, let me try it again. Not that many weeks left. It's poor, very poor. Okay, so any questions about anything before we start? Before we dive in? Okay, medical training. So thank you. So to be a doctor, one thing I found when I first started working in a public health department is that, started to deal with students who were coming into biology and coming into, other areas, is about 70% of the students who come in as freshmen are thinking about being doctors. So 70% of students don't become doctors at any school. And so part of the question is, well, why do so many students come in wanting to be or considering to be a doctor? So I came to the conclusion is that, well, partly it's because, you're all bright and that you're bright in high school. And so bright people in high school are usually told at some point, you should be a doctor. And so that's just one of the things that people kind of consider. I think the other thing that happens is that, doctors are kind of seen as esteemed positions. So therefore, doctors tend to be something that you sort of think of be a nice job to have. So, I think there's lots of reasons why it is that people want to become doctors. I think it's also something for which a lot of people along the way decide not to become a doctor. And a lot of doctors, a lot of people who go into medicine end up kind of, I won't say stuck, but when you go and you train for medicine, you're basically training until you're about 30. And then, if you find out you don't really like being a doctor or you want to do something different, you're kind of at that point, you are a doctor or you are a nurse. So when I first started teaching in a public health, a master's of public health program, it was most of the students were doctors and nurses, because what they were is that they were doctors and nurses who had kind of practiced for maybe 10 years and that were now looking for something else. And, part of the problem with being in the clinical profession is that if you're in the clinical profession, it's not that easy to move into other positions. And so MPH was one of the ways that, that they could go and learn statistics. And so then being an epidemiologist or learn, how to run clinical trials and get into research or something. So it is something for which, medicine as a profession is something that attracts a lot of people into it, hopefully for the right reason, that they want to kind of help people. But oftentimes it is something for which, you are that is your profession for life. Whereas if if you study, I don't know, business, you study business and that you can switch jobs fairly easily. But when you're in the clinical profession, you're a clinician. So in terms of the number of medical schools, we've talked about kind of what happened with medical schools, how the Flexner report came through in the 1907 and basically cut out a whole bunch of different types of medical schools. This is the number of medical schools that started. So you can see is that there was this, pretty rapid growth in the 50s and 60s and 70s and up until the 2000s. And it's occurring now. I mean, there's a new medical school in Fresno that just opened a few years ago. There's one in Sacramento that opened just a couple of years ago. So there are more medical schools all the time that are opening. As we discussed, medical schools kind of went through this merging with universities back in the late 1800s. But then after the Flexner report came through, then medical schools were usually mostly very, very closely tied with universities. And as I described before, part of the issue that comes along with when you're in medical school is that you need a whole bunch of different people to teach a small amount of things to your medical class. So I think I told you that when I first started teaching in medical school, they told me that I was going to go teach them about health economics, and I'd have 3 hours. And so I thought, 3 hours a week, teach about health economics. I could do that. So I developed a course syllabus and the curriculum. I was all ready. I would go to my head of the department and say, look, here's my curriculum. And the head of the department, who was an epidemiologist, said, oh, no, you get 3 hours for the year, and that we've just cut it down to 2 hours. And so 2 hours meant that not much you can teach in 2 hours. So I decided what I was going to teach, because I thought, well, I was going to teach about how doctors respond to financial incentives, because it's been something that's been a big deal in medicine about how to basically change behavior through using payment systems. So I started I got into the class, and there was a big class, about maybe 85 people, 90 people, all in the class. And the way that the medical school worked is that this was kind of this is one of the old style school medical programs where these students in their first and second year, they'd come into these classes and they'd sit there for all day. And what would happen is that they would have people come in and talk to them for an hour about anatomy, and then come talk to an hour about physiology, and then talk for an hour. So they would just through the day, they'd have all these different types of people come through. And then at 5 o'clock, they'd go home, have something to eat, and then study until 12 o'clock, and then wake up the next day and do it again. So that was the kind of the life of a first and second year medical school student. So for me, coming in as a health economist, I tried to think, well, I want to make this somewhat relevant to them. So I got in there and I started to, talk about how doctors respond to financial incentives. And I had people yelling at me, like these students were standing up and they were saying, doctors don't respond to financial incentives. And they were very, very angry. And and so I kind of walked away, got out of there, and then went back and asked someone. They said, well, yeah, these are first year medical students. And first year medical students, they definitely think that, that they want to help people. And so that's what they do. And so they sit there in these classes all day, and they think that someone who comes in is talking about anything other than clinical care. They're just not that interested in it. And if it's something for which it's insulting them by saying that they're there just for the money, then it really, upsets them. So a couple months later, the head department comes back up and says, I want you to go talk to the 5th year medical students. And I thought, uh-oh, I don't want to get yelled at again. So this time I thought of the most boring type of uncontroversial topic I could think of. So I go in there and start talking about something, I forget what it was, something really, really dull, even more dull than the usual things I talk about. I went in there and started talking to him about it. And someone interrupts me and says, so why is it that they're paying us so little money? And so, I tried to answer about this. And then someone else says, why is it that we have to sit there and beg for equipment? And all they want to talk about is money. And I realized that, it's not that they don't like money. It's just that during the first couple of years, they want to be doctors but by the time that they're in the 5th year, they're starting to see kind of what it's like as a business and things like that. And so by that point, then they're really concerned about money and why their junior doctors are getting paid so little and all these other kind of things that come up. So I mention this because, you know, I'm going to talk a lot about money and about, you know, about sort of medicine in terms of like what their salaries are. And just realizes that for most, you know, for most clinicians, not just doctors, but nurses and everyone else, there's always these two sides, that sacred and profane side. There's on one hand is that people do it because they, you know, this is what they want to do and they want to help people. On the other hand, people like to make money too. And so, you know, you can have both of those different type of motivations going at the same time. They're usually not in conflict. Sometimes they are, but it is a fact that as a guy who used to run a hospital that I knew and had to deal with doctors groups a lot, he said, well, with doctors, the thing to remember is that it's not always their money is not always their first priority, but it's always number one or two. So with that, so the way that healthcare, that hospitals kind of, or medical schools kind of grew up in the 1950s was that the government started to make a lot of grants available. And so what medical schools started to do is that, you know, they needed to have someone like, you know, a health economist that could come talk to them for 3 hours a year. And they needed to have, you know, some different types of, you know, of biochemists and people like that who would come and only do short periods of time. But the question is, well, what do those biochemists or economists or other people do when they're not going through and teaching these medical students? So the government came through and started offering a bunch of research grants. And so what people would do is that they would write research grants. And so, you know, people who are biochemists would get, they'd have some money that's from teaching medical, you know, for their salary. Some of the money was from teaching medical students, but other money that they would get from government grants. And government grants were fairly easy to get at that point. And so, you know, someone might be 50%, 60% of their salary was paid for by grants. That's called soft money. So I'm not sure if you ever heard this term. That's called soft money researchers. So if you look at universities, is that universities faculty are usually split into soft money research, soft money and hard money. Hard money are people whose salary is paid for from the university. Soft money are people who have their salaries, they have to generate their own salary. So like Johns Hopkins, you know, one of the best medical schools in the country. Johns Hopkins, the vast majority of faculty at Johns Hopkins are soft money researchers. That means that they have to bring in, I think it's 200% of their salary in grants every year. So like if my salary is, I don't know, my salary is $150,000, I have to bring in $300,000 in grants because just to cover my salary. So that's what soft money universities do, is that, you know, people on soft money is that they have to bring in grants. So this is the way that universities in the US kind of grew up, as, you know, Stanford, Harvard, all these places grew up with a split between hard money and soft money type of researchers. And back then it was fairly easy because there were lots of grants, you know, people back in those areas, what if they wanted to write a grant, they usually just wrote a grant, sent to the government, and they got funded. Now, if you want to get a grant from the government, it might take years to go through the different rounds to get the grant. So it's changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years. But back then, there was lots of money available. So that's the way that universities kind of grew up. They arose, these medical schools grew up as partly soft money, partly then hard money clinical people. So academic universities then, like if you're a university and that you want to have a medical school, you have to have a hospital that's associated with it, because, you know, the medical students, they spend 2 years being trained just in classes or small groups, whatever it's going to be, but it's not touching patients. And then the last 2 years, years 3 and 4, that's where they go out there and they need to do rotations. And rotations means that they're kind of partly classroom work, but mostly they're out there on hospital floors in a pediatric ward, or if they're in the you know, orthopedic ward or whatever it's going to be, they go through rotations. And so it means that from a medical school standpoint, they need a big enough hospital around that they can go through and that they can have enough rotations. So for example, down at, you know, UCSF, over there in, you know, San Francisco, they have UCSF Hospital. So UCSF Hospital, gigantic hospital. They have all the different type of specialties in that hospital, and they have clinical staff then that kind of see the patients, and the clinical staff then also go ahead and that they will you know, do the teaching as well. So they split their time between teaching, clinical work, and then probably a lot of them also get research money as well. So they fund themselves either through clinical work, through their teaching, or through grants. UCSF Fresno down here, right? UCSF Fresno doesn't have its own hospital. It's part of, it has a deal with Community Medical Center. So then, you know, down in downtown Fresno, big hospitals, Community Medical Center. But Community Medical Center for a long time didn't have pediatric wards. And so what students would do is that students would go over to Children's Hospital for their pediatric rounds. So that students from UCSF would come out to do a stint in the Valley. They would do some of their specialties, I mean, some of their things in the community hospital, and they'd go over to Children's Hospital and do other ones. So that's kind of the way hospitals work, is, you know, medical schools work, is that you have to have a big enough number of different specialties that you can go through and get all the different type of rounds. Okay, so currently there's 192 medical schools as of last night when I checked the numbers. 192 medical schools in the US, 155 are MD, and the other 37 are DO. So MD and DO are there's two different types of doctors, right? There can be MDs and DOs. MDs are medical doctors, and DOs are doctors of osteopathic medicine. So in theory, MDs are different than DOs. MD is allopathic medicine, and DO is osteopathic medicine. Osteopathic medicine is supposed to be focused more upon holistic training of the person and things like that. So, you know, you can go to a DO school or you can go to an MD school. In practice, though, there's not much difference between MDs and DOs in terms of the everyday world that you go. They can both get jobs in the same places. They both kind of are trained pretty much the same way. I mean, DOs have a little bit different emphasis than MDs, but for the most part, you know, people never really know whether or not you have an MD or DO that's treating you. But just realize that there are the two different things. The curriculum is that there's essentially 4 years of medical school, and then after that you have a residency. So the medical school is split up into the first 2 years, which are your preclinical years, and then years 3 and 4, which are your clinical years. And then after your clinical years, then you're in residency. And the residency can vary from a couple years to 7 years, depending upon what area you go into. So I won't expect you to know everything that's in the first year, but the first year curriculum is very set in the sense that, you know, there are, to be a medical school, you have to be accredited by a accrediting body. And the accrediting body comes in and looks at the medical program and says, you know, how are you teaching all these things? To the point of like, they actually go through the materials and it's pretty rigorous how they go through and do it. Second year, so first year is anatomy, physiology, histology, biochemistry, embryology, neuroanatomy. Don't see economics and health economics in that list, or public health. Or second year is pathology, pharmacology, microbiology, immunology. During the second year is also when they take their first kind of exam. So they take the boards, and the boards then is that they take one type of boards after the second year, the second one after the third year, then the fourth years. They have to do their boards every year. If you fail your board, then you have to redo that year. They can't, until they pass their second year boards, they can't actually deal with patients. So like up at Davis, the medical students, you know, they have started there's a clinic there, student-run clinic in downtown Sacramento. So the clinic is staffed by medical students, including first-year medical students. But the first-year medical students they can't actually touch a patient, right? All that they can do is things like schedule appointments, things like that, be a receptionist. So they can do that. After they pass their second year boards, then they can start, dealing things with patients. A couple years ago, when I first got here, there was a number of students who wanted to start a clinic, and they were going to work with a doctor from Golden Valley to basically start a clinic downtown. And the only reason I found out about it was because I was at the time, I was the kind of, leading the medical education kind of push on campus. And the only reason I found out about it is because the students kind of came by and said, hey, we're starting a clinic, and, how can we advertise, how do we advertise on campus? And I said, you're starting a clinic? And they said, yeah. And I came to find out is that, yeah, this doctor over there at Golden Valley, he was going to start a clinic downtown and have these undergraduate medical, students who had never studied medicine be the kind of train them how to provide care. And so we had to say, well, no, you can't actually do that. Especially you can't do that in the name of the UC because, that's illegal to do it. So there are very strict rules in terms of when you could actually come through and do things. Anyway, so they take boards all the way through, and then they go for the residency, and then they have a residency exams at the end of that. So residency, occurs after, so you have 2 years preclinical, 2 years clinical, and then you have your residency. Residency goes 3 to 7 years, depending upon what your specialty is. Now there are, 192 whatever medical schools in the States, but there's lots of residency programs. And the way that the residency programs work is like if you wanted, is that everyone puts in, during their 4th year, all the medical students put in where they want to do a residency. So, you can put in, I want to do Stanford and I want to do Harvard and all the rest, right? And meanwhile, Stanford and Harvard, they put in who they want. And then all of this goes into a big it goes into a big computer program, and it comes up with matches. So they match students based upon like what, who wants them and where they want to go in terms of the residency. Yeah. Say it again.
When you're taking the course of math, what other qualifications do
I don't think so. I think they do it. I mean, it's a good question. It's my impression they do it all just upon the match of how much the school, like who the school, because the schools rank people that they want. So like let's say if you're at Stanford and you want to do your residency at UCSF, right? You would apply to UCSF and say, I want to do my residency there. And UCSF then would look at your grades and look at everything else. And then, UCSF gets all these other people apply to it, and then they rank people. And so then when you go through and you would do this, all these different places you want to go to, and so you have your rank and they have their rank. And then what they do is that they kind of see, what the matches is. So if you say, I want to go to UCSF, and UCSF says, he's our first candidate, then you'll go there. But if you say, I want to go to UCSF, and UCSF ranks you as number, 200, then you're not going to go to UCSF. So then what it does is it goes to your second rank. And if your second rank is Harvard, and Harvard has you at 400, then you're not going to go to Harvard. And so it means that you have to be kind of strategic in terms of where it is that you are, what you're going to place. And you have to kind of assess what's my chance of getting into UCSF versus what's my chance of getting into, Loma Linda or someplace else, some other type of residency program. And like, Mercy Hospital, they take in medical residents. In fact, most of these places around here will take in medical residents. So like over at Mercy, they're usually medical residents who are being trained in family medicine. On the other hand, if you want to be a neurosurgeon, then you're not going to go to Mercy. You're going to have to go to someplace where they do neurosurgery. So that's why it's really competitive in terms of what you get into, which of the specialties you get into, which of the residency programs you get into. You know, UC Merced, you want to hear about UC Merced's kind of attempts to get a medical school? Okay. So let's see, we only have a half hour, but I'll try and break down, just tell you the gory details. So UC Merced, you know, when it was started back in 2001, when they first started talking about it, one of the reasons why they put it here was because people wanted a medical school in the valley, right? Because not enough medically underserved areas. You know, traditionally this is a place that didn't really have medical schools. I mean, they had UCSF Fresno, but it's not really a medical school. It's just a satellite branch of UCSF. And so that was one of the big things. And so when the first chancellor that got in here and the first dean of science embraced this, and they went around telling everyone that they were going to put together a medical school, including like raising money for a medical school. And the model that they were going to have was a model that said that they were going to use Mercy Hospital, I think Doctors Medical Center up in Modesto, and one other hospital. They were going to try and have this 3 type of hospital system so that students would come in here and get trained, and then they would go to you know, do doing their clinical year, one of those 3 different spots and things like that. So anyways, it was a I don't want to say stupid, unrealistic plan, because one, there was only what, 13 faculty on campus when it started, right? So, you know, there wasn't, if you think about how many faculty you need to have a medical program, it's just immense. So there was absolutely no way. The medical programs, when you start one, you have to have $200 million around to start a medical program. It's really expensive. So it just wasn't realistic. And the faculty revolted, right? You know, by this point, there's probably about 50 faculty on campus. They revolted, and that, you know, essentially led to the chancellor being kicked out and the dean of science, you know, being kicked out. So then for a long time here, there was nothing that happened. So when I came, was hired, because I was hired to start a public health program. And then they asked me to basically to start a health sciences research institute. So I did, and the chancellor, before she like signed her name, she said, so, you know, we want you as HSRI to essentially take the lead in discussions of medical education. Because the new chancellor, every time she went out to talk to the community, people would say, when are we going to start a medical school? When are we going to start a medical school? And so, you know, she didn't really, this was not the point where she was going to do anything about it. So she basically put it on us. So we as the faculty then, well, I shouldn't say that. She realized that this had to be a faculty-led thing, right? Whatever happened, the faculty had to be on board with. So she wanted the faculty to basically tell her what to do. So we went and got a group together of faculty, and we went looking at different types of models for medical education. And the one that was the best, that, you know, perfect for us was Berkeley has what's called the Joint Medical Program, the JMP. And what the JMP program is that students are actually admitted into UCSF, but they spend their first 2 non-clinical years at Berkeley. And that Berkeley, then their public health department essentially runs this program. It's all case-based study. So we looked and we thought, perfect, right? Because we can do that here. We could do the case-based type of programs here. We could have the similar type of arrangement that they have at Berkeley. We could have it here. So the faculty was all in favor of this. And then it just kind of fell into a black hole. And it's because, you know, UCSF, we've realized after some time, UCSF doesn't really like the JMP model, because what medical schools want is they want control over, you know, because they have to be accredited. And so they want control over how the teaching's done. And what was happening there is that you're having the teaching done by Berkeley, but they were still UCSF students. And so UCSF didn't want to have UC Merced faculty teaching their UCSF students. So they just weren't in favor of it. So it went for a time and then just sort of died off. But then, you know, it's sort of now been, you know, what's happened is that UCSF Fresno now has come through and has said, well, they want to sort of start a joint medical program with us. However, what it looks like it really is that there'll be students, undergraduates here who can apply to get sort of special entry into that program, guaranteed entry into that program. So there'll be a certain number of students, I don't know, maybe 6, something like that, every year, who can come out from UC Merced, who can get entry. But the medical program is still going to be a UCSF medical program. It's going to be run down there at Fresno. Students will be admitted into UCSF, et cetera. And so that seems to be kind of the way that it's going. So even though it's being called the UC Merced Medical School, it's not really a UC Merced Medical School. Because for UC Merced to do a medical school, we'd have to have a 300-bed hospital out there on Yosemite Boulevard, and that's just not going to happen. This area just doesn't have the population to support Mercy Hospital and the 300-bed hospital out there at Yosemite. So I think that as you go forward, there's probably you're probably hearing about that you can apply to go into this program, right? Yeah. Say it louder. Yeah. 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 And then it gets you sort of a place in the waiting room. And that if you then go through and you get the grades and everything else, then they guarantee you a place at UCSF, right? Yeah. So it's a good program. I mean, it definitely, well, yeah, okay. It's a good program in that it will, it will help students from UC Merced get into medical school. I mean, one thing that's been clear is if you look at the number of UC Merced students who actually get into medical school, it's really low. And the reason is that it's tough to get into medical school. You also have to get clinical experience as part of your, as you go through an undergraduate. And that's been the big problem here, is getting clinical experience. Because like Mercy Hospital, which would be the main place that you would get clinical experience, they take in a couple students a year. Well, not very many. So there hasn't traditionally been a lot of avenues for students to go out there and get that clinical experience. And so, this will be a good thing in terms of moving students along like that. It also means, because when I first started in the medical school, the reason that they hired me, so it's turned into a long story. The reason they hired me this was down at the Auckland Medical School, was because the Auckland Medical School was in financial trouble. And that they knew that they needed to get more students into the medical school, but into the medical school writ large. So they were starting a nursing program, and they were starting a pharmacy program, and they wanted to start a public health program. And so the way they set it up is they said, well, to get into the medical program, the medical school, right? To get in medical school, you could apply directly if you had an undergraduate degree. But the other way to do it is that you could you could get in through either a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Health Science. And so I was basically running the Bachelor of Health Science program. And so we had lots and lots of students who wanted to apply because, and this was in your first year, right out of high school, you applied to this. And if you got in, then, you went for 1 year, and at the end of the year, then they either admitted you into this, special medical program or not. And so, but the number of students they actually admitted in was pretty small. So we would have maybe 300 students here, and they would admit maybe 15, which meant that there's a whole bunch of students who had come into this program looking to get into medicine. But then what are they going to do now, right? Because they're not going to get into medicine. So some of them drifted off into other types of programs. But the other ones, that's basically where a public health program kind of started in. Because public health was sort of the other things that people could do if you're interested in health and you're not going to be and you're not going to go into medicine, is that then public health comes in. And so what you've seen since then is you see a lot of different, I'd say most schools around the country now have a undergraduate public health program, because it turns out that there are jobs for undergraduate public health majors. And so, people started going into some undergraduate public health, and then they started getting jobs in the healthcare system. And so that kind of reinforces it because students like to go into something where they can get jobs. So, yeah. So that's why I don't think that will happen here, because it seems like they're doing it, after your first year, you can go into the program. Is that what it is? You get admitted, so you come here for a year and then you get it in. And you can either do it from natural science or from public health. Can you do it from any background? I mean, any major?
For the BS, going for like a biological science major or biochemistry or in relation to that field. And then when applying to your high school to fight and then go to like a week, couple of weeks project. Going to do project interviews and once they find deciding they gotta get a meeting. I think it's really good. It's the first program where we do 2 years and then 2 years over there.
Yeah. And there's a long debate in when these discussions were going on about what type of training do you need to get into medicine, is that usually medical schools are dominated by science faculty. So that's why when you look at what the prerequisites are for getting into medicine, it's usually biochemistry and organic chemistry and all these different things. They usually don't have psychology or sociology or things like that. You can get into a medicine if you have those type of backgrounds, but oftentimes, you've got to go ahead and take the biology and all the rest of the stuff. So what a lot of people do who want to get into medicine, who are going to study psychology, is they'll study psychology and they'll either minor in something that gives them those credits, or what they do is they just take those classes and then apply to medicine. So, but somehow you have to get these prerequisites that go in. So the question is, well, why is science, the kind of the dominant thing in terms of getting into medicine? And it's been primarily because, science is the ones where, since the Flexner report, medicine was supposed to be science-based, and science meant chemistry and biology and things like that. If when we would talk to doctors who actually ran the medical program, they'd say, we don't use this stuff. I mean, they do, they have to know it, but it's not on a day-to-day basis. The things they really need are psychology and understanding how to deal with patients and things like that. So there's always this tension then that goes on in medical schools about how much should medicine be science-based versus how much should medicine be about things like psychology. And the science people always win out. Every place I've seen the science people win out. Okay. So, so I'm not trying to diss on UC Merced's efforts for medical education. I think it's really good. Just that I don't think that in our lifetime, well, my lifetime, maybe yours, you're going to see a medical school, located on campus. They would need $200 million. And what happens every time that they bring it up is that Davis and UCSF would sit there and say to the state legislature, why are you giving $200 million to start a new medical school when we can just expand our medical school? Which is all true. Any questions about UC Merced before I go on? So in terms of how medical education has changed, well, up until the 1990s, the majority was kind of the way I described it, where people, first couple of years, they walk into a room and they sit there and someone talks to them for 8 hours. And then they go back into study and they come back in and do it again. That was the didactic type of method. And what's happened, after that is that there was a big movement away from, mainly driven by doctors who said, this is a horrible way for us to learn how to actually be a doctor, and to more case-based learning, or problem-based learning. So now I think they have to have medical students during those first couple of years have to have, I think 50% of their education has to be, case-based learning or problem-based learning. So for example, like the JMP model, the reason that at Berkeley, the reason it was so attractive to us is that they have very little classroom work. I think they had epidemiology and maybe a couple other things. For the most part, very little classroom work. What they do is that they get together in small groups and they have a what do they call them? Not mentor, not precept, but they have someone who's basically just a faculty member who's there. And the faculty member doesn't have to be a doctor. In fact, it should be someone from a different area. And then they're given a case. And then they have to go through and kind of, they have reference books and they have the internet, they have all these different clinical guidelines and everything else. They go through and that as a group, they try to figure out, what's wrong with this person. And then they come back with their ideas. And then the instructors will say, oh, here's some more information. And then they have to go back and do it. And so it's all very interactive and case-based. At the same time, they also have to go through and study for their boards. So they still get anatomy and physiology and things like that. They still get the basic type things, only it's not done just sitting here like I'm doing now, lecturing to you. Instead, it's done in all this case-based type of method. So that's kind of where medical education writ large has gone. It's gone much more to case-based. That said, they still have to pass the boards, and the boards still are going to assume that they know everything about anatomy and physiology and et cetera. In fact, one of the criticisms of the JMP model was that it said, well, yes, you can do everything case-based, but at the end of the day, and the students who went through the JMP model, were always scored really well on the boards, always do really well. And so, one way to interpret that is that, well, this is such a good model, could these students do really well on the boards afterwards? The other way to interpret is that UCSF is the top medical school in the country. The ones who get in the JMP are going to be like the brightest of the bright. And so they would probably pass the boards if all they did is they went in there and watched, Ren and Snippy all day. They probably still pass the boards. So the alternative, the other explanation that, well, maybe this thing doesn't translate into other things because it's just the students are so bright. And that's probably part of the reason why there's always this tension that exists in medical schools about how much to do case-based learning versus how much there's to do, the more didactic type thing. Because at the end of the day, they have to pass the boards. And the boards are going to be, require that you have all this knowledge. Okay. So you go and you go to medical school, then you go into residency. You go between 3 and 7 years in your residency. That's called being a junior doctor. And so junior doctors usually complain because they typically have to work night shifts and long hours, and they also don't get paid very much. So a friend of mine was he was a doctor, a resident at Hopkins, at Johns Hopkins, and he had an apartment, and he said that he didn't go to his apartment for 40 straight days, because what he was doing is that he was in a surgery residency. And so what he would do is that he was doing just double shifts all the time, 8-hour shifts followed by another 8-hour shift. And so rather than go all the way, to his apartment, he would just sleep at the hospital. And then the next day, 8-hour shift, sleep at the hospital. And I asked him, I said, aren't you exhausted? He said, yeah, you're just exhausted all the time. He said that the easiest thing to do is actually to do surgery, because it's just very rote and you don't have to think. The hardest thing is if you have to go in the emergency room and deal with cases. I thought to myself, remind me never to get surgery from a resident who's basically on his 16th hour of being awake over 40 days. But that's the way that most hospitals kind of deal with residents, is they give them night shifts and things like that. And what residents always say is they say, when I become a doctor, I'm not going to do this to the junior doctors. And so, but then when they become doctors, they don't change it. So why don't they change it? Yeah.
Because they don't want to do it.
Right. Because who else is going to do it? These doctors, they don't want to go through and you're a 40-year-old doctor. You don't want to sit there and spend the night, have all these night shifts like that. It's a good thing for residents. It builds their character, gets them used to working under pressure, all these different things. So this is the sacred and the profane, but it means that it's gone on forever. It will continue to go on forever because basically doctors don't really want to go through. And once you've gone through it, you don't want to go through and do all these night shifts. The U.S. has by far the largest ratio of specialists to family doctors. So remember, the distinction here is that you go to medical school and you can either come out and be a general practitioner, / family doctor, or you can go into a specialty. And the specialties are things like, let's see. Well, I'll show you in a second. But the specialties are things like, neurology and surgery and, orthopedics and all these different things. Those are all specialties. And so the specialties usually take longer. You have to go through additional type of training to be a specialist. So I think like cardiologist, you have to go for 7 years. I think general practitioner, you have to go for 3 years. So, it's a big deal because if you're thinking about, when you want to start earning money, you can't really start earning money until you're done with your residency. And so if you go 7 years of residency, that means you've gone 4 years as an undergraduate, 4 years in medical school, and now 7 years of residency. So, I mean, you're in now your 15th year. So you're in your mid-30s by the time you actually come out and start practicing. So that's a long time to basically survive on, on not very much salary. And usually, as you get up on your residency, your salary does go up. So it's not quite as bad, but still, it is something for which, it is a long period of time to not be able to kind of do your profession. Like for PhD, we go 4 years and then 5 years, right? So it's a while, but not like 4 years, and then 7 years. That's a long time. All right. These are the top medical schools as rated by one of the ratings I could find. Harvard, Stanford, Hopkins, UCSF, Columbia, Penn, Duke, Michigan, Yale, UCLA. There are a lot more nursing schools in the country. There's over 2,600 nursing schools. Where are the nearest nursing schools to here? Fresno has a nursing school, Cal State Fresno. Where else? Does Merced College have one? And then Stanislaus has a nursing program. There are different types of nursing programs, right? There's, there's different degrees of like specialty. So when UCs have nursing programs, it's usually more of the research, based, more specialty type of nursing programs. Whereas a Merced College, I assume, is going to have a much more like a, they won't be offering the advanced degrees in nursing. Top nursing programs in the country: Hopkins again, Penn, UCSF, etc. In California, there are, I could find 148 nursing programs, and that 87 offer associate degrees or certificates in nursing, so that must be Mercy College. 41 offers bachelor degrees, so that would be Stanislaus and Fresno. And then 38 offers master's or other, that would be like UCLA and such. And those are the top ones in California, in case you want to go to nursing. Okay, well, tell you what, why don't we stop there? And we'll start there on Thursday. And I promise you Thursday I won't tell you as many stories. So.
Yeah, I can't wait to do this. I can't wait to use it or running. I got to put the date. Yeah,
How you're staying up with this.